Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our lecture for today. We are going to talk about the psychodynamic model. So, the psychodynamic model is named as such by Freud because you have different parts of the psyche, which we're going to talk about really quickly on the next slide, that interact with one another. And that's what we mean by dynamic, how they interact. And this model is going to largely look at how a person's behavior is determined by underlying psychological forces of which he or she is not consciously aware. So we're looking at the unconscious mind, and also Freud was big on childhood experiences. And so just remember that that dynamic means interacting with one another. So there's an interaction between someone's behaviors, their thoughts, and their emotions, right? Consistently, there's going to be an interaction, and that's going to lead to those actions in normal functioning. And so when something is functioning abnormally in a psychodynamic model, we are looking at what kind of problems, what kind of interacting forces are causing abnormal functioning for this person. So conflicting forces. And when we say forces, we mean the id, ego, and superego. And we're going to look at that further. But one important thing to follow with the psychodynamic model is this whole idea of the deterministic assumption. It means that everything has a purpose, like every behavior has an intention. So maybe there's an episode of Frasier. It was an old sitcom in the 90s. I love it. But there's an episode of Frasier where he got into a fight with his dad or something, the character. And afterward, he accidentally dropped like his dad's favorite chair over a balcony or something like that. And he said it was an accident. Well, some people went, are you sure it was an accident? Right? That questioning is underlying the deterministic assumption. So it could be that there was something latent. You had some latent intent or meaning behind that behavior. So that's what we're looking at. I put in this image of an iceberg because it's best representative of the id, ego, and the superego, because your id it works on your pleasure principle. These are the forces through which Freud believed that are interacting to facilitate our behavior, our emotions, and our thoughts. The id is like this evil little monster who lives in your unconscious mind, and it's all the pleasure principle. It's focused on gaining pleasure. This has a lot to do with instinctual needs, drives, and impulses. So sex and aggression were big with Freud. Then we have the ego, which stems from the id as you develop. And the ego functions on the reality principle. And it says, sure, id, you may want to do all these things. But you know what? You can't always do these things when you want. It functions on reality. There's only certain times you can eat, okay? You can't eat all the time. Your ego is where you form defense mechanisms, which, if you were in my class, we talked about defense mechanisms, and I think the other instructors talk about them as well. But defense mechanisms, I included a pretty decent link from Very Well Mind that kind of encapsulates defense mechanisms, if you want to click that. They are responses to the id that we engage in to kind of deter us from unwanted behaviors. So one of the most famous ones is repression. People say, oh, that's a repressed memory or something of that. Psychodynamic perspective looks at repression a lot. Repression is just forceful forgetting. So we kind of push something out of our consciousness, push it away so we can't remember it. That's the idea of repression. It's a defense mechanism through which we work. I'll let you check out that link because I am trying to keep this video succinct for you. But then we also have the superego. Now the superego stems from the ego, and it is going to function on the morality principle. And that's going to say basically what is right and wrong, quote unquote. So it incorporates a lot of what we learn through our parents and those figures. All right? And so it's very different from the reality principle. The reality principle is stating what's possible, whereas the morality principle is looking at what's kind of good and bad. And as you'll see from the image on the left, we have an iceberg as that's a symbol of our consciousness, because there are some things we can be aware of. We're aware of how our ego is functioning. We're aware of our superego. But there's some things that lie deep in the depth of our unconscious that we can't access, and that's the id and parts of the superego. And then you'll see this level called the preconscious, where Freud believed that we can pull some things out of that level if we really worked at it. So hopefully that was a good little explanation for you. Those are very important forces, and Freud even believed that the id, ego, and superego, when we go through our development, our personality development, we have theory of psychosexual development. We're looking at how people go from developing that id, ego, and superego throughout their early life. Because early life, we're focused exclusively on pleasure, right? And then we learn that that can only come at certain times. And then that's also influenced by our caretakers. And that's so much why we emphasize the role of the parents in the psychodynamic perspective, because they're responsible for rearing us and making sure that we develop accordingly. Other psychodynamic explanations look at different theories. Some people, Neo-Freudians, kind of navigated a bit away from the influence of sex in someone's life, but still focused on those unconscious desires or experiences. So there's a theory of the self, which focuses on the role of the self. So how we see the concept of us. That's the self, right? How we view us. Is it a unified personality? We want to make sure everything's working harmoniously. Whereas object relations theory looks at how people are motivated by the needs to have relationships with others. So this is very much derivative of that idea of the caretaker and how it's responsible in our life for helping us develop that id, ego, superego. And it kind of believes that those problems in relationships between the child and caregivers will lead to abnormal functioning, because those are the first social influences you kind of have in your life. So the thought is that it may affect other influences and other interactions with different people. For different psychodynamic therapies, because we're focusing on the unconscious mind, we're trying to find a way to get that information out of the preconscious, out of the unconscious, bring it up to consciousness so we can work on it. And that's the idea behind these different therapies. We have free association, which is just the patient is going to describe every thought, feeling, or image that comes to their mind. So maybe they'll be like, yeah, yesterday I was eating my food. It was pretty bland. It was some eggs with peppers. My husband walked in. I didn't really acknowledge him. And then my kid was screaming and they bit me. And then, my mom called, right? And so they're going to keep going through this scenario, sometimes hypothetical in their head, and list every detail that they can see. And it's up to the therapist interpretation to kind of decide what could be lying underneath. And with the therapist's interpretation, this is kind of an essential component for all of these processes in psychodynamic therapy, but it's kind of classified in its own. Resistance, transference, and dreams. So resistance, the therapist is going to notice if the client is resisting talking about something. That's going to be a red flag for, oh, something's there, right? Transference is just this idea that the client is putting their feelings for another person onto the therapist. So if they have issues with their dad and they're scared of making an error in front of their dad, maybe they may be scared of making an error in front of their therapist, okay? That's the idea, that you kind of hold people of similar status. You're kind of like putting that same status on another person. So maybe you obviously don't know your therapist is not your dad, but you're putting some of the same feelings towards that figure. And dream analysis, which is just analyzing the thoughts that come into the dreams, because Freud believed that our superego and ego were less active in our sleep, so the id, the unconscious desires, were coming out. And then you have catharsis and working through. And these two can sound very similar, so I want to make a point of distinction between them. Catharsis is reliving past repressed feelings and working through internal conflicts. So those past repressed feelings that have been pushed to the side. Whereas working through doesn't necessarily have to work through, I shouldn't use that term again, repressed feelings, but examining the same issues. These can be conscious issues, not just repressed ones. And last slide for this short little video is assessing the psychodynamic model. So we have the pros of psychodynamic model is it gives us abnormal functioning as a part of normal functioning. And what we mean by that is that it's kind of saying, hey, this process through which we develop can go awry sometimes. It doesn't seem like there's some other force affecting it. For example, with the biological model, we see that, we see that psychological disorders are a result of something entirely different kind of infiltrating the system, which could be like an excess of neurotransmitters or different problems with the brain circuit. Well, this is just saying abnormal functioning is just something wrong that happened in the process of normal functioning. So maybe your development. And it has had a monumental impact on treatment. The psychodynamic model was the first to apply theory to psychological therapeutic techniques. And it's still widely used today. About 18% of psychologists identify as a psychodynamic psychologist, so using that psychoanalytic approach. But it does have some shortcomings. It's hard to research because we don't know if there are unconscious processes. And if we did, how are you supposed to measure them if people aren't even aware of their own unconscious thoughts? How are we supposed to pull that out? And a lot of their evidence relies on case studies, and which, as you know, can be quite limiting because we can't generalize the results. And even though they're really detailed, it could be the case for one person and not a whole bunch that different methods have worked. But still, a lot of those methods that we talked about on the last slide with those therapies have been adapted and used. And it's kind of pragmatic in its approach that, okay, if it works on the person, let's use it. Stay tuned for the next part.